Ladies and gentlemen, piracy just took a massive, massive blow. Yes, Kadokawa, Shueisha, and Shogakukan has won a big, big victory in the Tokyo District Court against, yes, Cloudflare, claiming they are actually aiding in copyright infringement utilizing their CDN. Now, I am extremely, extremely mixed on this whole news right here. I'm not a big, massive fan of piracy, but at the same time, I do acknowledge that piracy itself is a very easy way to access content, especially content that's not legally available really anywhere, especially a lot of countries that don't have like legitimate sources where they can go to and pay for this content. At the same time, I do acknowledge that these companies own these properties and they thus should be able to go after people that are stealing it. It's a very mixed bag here. At the same time, with this whole situation here, Cloudflare is being sued for something they're not really themselves technically doing. And that's the big difficulty in this entire case, and I think probably why this actually won in Tokyo courts and not anywhere else. With that all said, let's get into this, and I'll get into greater details as we go along. Right here, we have the post made by Kadokawa claimed they had made this victory. Let's actually go to the actual PDF announcement they gave out. It says, victory against Cloudflare Inc. The Tokyo District Court judgment found copyright infringement and ordered substantial damages. It's not really that big of damages, but it could actually affect some change. Kadokawa Corporation hereby announces that in the copyright infringement lawsuit against Cloudflare, which was filed jointly with Kodansha, Shueisha, Shogakukan, in the Tokyo District Court, rendered a judgment recognizing Cloudflare Inc. liable for damages on November 19, 2025. Kadokawa expects this ruling will lead to prevention of abuse of content delivery network CDN services by piracy sites and maintenance of a content creation cycle that returns appropriate compensation to creators. As a comprehensive entertainment company engaged in a range of businesses, including publishing, anime, live action, and gaming, Kadokawa will continue to act resolutely to address copyright infringement and contribute to copyright protection and the further development of creative activities. Before we go any further, I want to really kind of explain a couple things here so that people understand what's going on. First things first, yes, Kadokawa, Shueisha, and Shogakukan, they're obviously going to be big publishing companies for different manga and anime and whatnot. They're the rights holder of all these different properties. And for the while now, you of course have the situation where all these companies in Japan are seeing that people are accessing their stuff illegally, and they're trying to put a stop to it. So they go to publish the latest, chapter of One Piece, and suddenly everybody's looking at it on this, piracy site. So they're actively looking for these piracy sites and trying to shut them down. Now, why does Cloudflare come into play here? Because a lot of people are wondering, hey, Cloudflare is sort of like that thing that pops up every now and then when I'm trying to access a website that says I can't access the website. Just yesterday, they had this big, massive downing, and that all these websites shut down. Kind of makes you wonder if these two things are related because it's literally dropped right at the same time. What Cloudflare basically offers to people is the ability to sort of be a middleman between a server hosting and people accessing things. So whenever you access a website, it essentially will go through Cloudflare first, and Cloudflare will then be able to give you a lot of the information without you actually having to go to the server. And that does help with, blocking DDoS attacks and whatnot. Now, why this has to do with piracy specifically is that what happened is that these companies in Japan were trying to figure out where these piracy sites are located at, and they were having to go through Cloudflare. And Cloudflare wasn't telling them the identity of these different piracy sites, who had the account on Cloudflare, where the server itself is located. They were essentially being a middleman that wasn't going to give them the information they wanted, because that information would be easily accessible through Cloudflare. So what they ended up doing was essentially filing a lawsuit against Cloudflare because they're technically pirating their content. Why is that? Well, this particular system, CDN, is a system that pretty much allows people to be able to host content without having to worry so much about too many people accessing the content. How it basically works is you'll set up a website with a hosting, and then you'll go through Cloudflare. And what Cloudflare will do is take a lot of the information from your hosting and the website you're hosting, and they will cache it on their servers around the world. What this sort of allows is two different things here. One, somebody doesn't have to go through a whole bunch of pipelines and go all the way across the world to access your server, and thus it's much faster. And additionally, because a lot of what you have on that hosting is on their servers closer to the user, Cloudflare is doing all the work. They're doing all the heavy lifting. All of your content is being pulled from them rather than your service, thus lowering your bandwidth use. And yes, what that means is all this copyrighted material that is on these piracy sites are essentially sitting on servers on Cloudflare. And that's where they got them. That's where essentially they're able to get them, because they're essentially hosting copyright infringement material. Now, what they'll claim here in a minute is that they were telling Cloudflare on a regular basis, you have our stuff, our content, our copyright and stuff on your servers, take them down. But at the same time, they were also asking for the identity of the people that were utilizing their service, and they weren't giving it to them. Victory against Cloudflare Inc. The plaintiffs notified Cloudflare, which had been providing CDN services to two massive manga piracy sites that posted over 4,000 manga works without permission, and at their peak attraction over 300 million monthly visits combined, that its CDN services were being used to operate manga piracy sites. We requested the company take measures such as stopping the distribution of pirated content from the servers under its management. So again, right here what it's saying is that we seen that they were providing CDN services for these piracy sites, and we told them to take it down. However, Cloudflare continued to provide services to the manga piracy sites even after receiving notices from the plaintiff. Furthermore, the company continued to provide services to the manga piracy sites even after receiving not only infringement notices from the plaintiff, but also information disclosures from the US courts based on copyright infringements. Again, I think we've kind of covered this before in a previous video or maybe as a podcast, but yeah, essentially they were, notifying them, and again, they were declining them. And there's a big reason for this, honestly, and this is where I get sort of my mixed feelings on this whole situation. I do sort of personally acknowledge what Cloudflare is doing as just simply a middleman. I really don't personally believe that Cloudflare themselves should be held liable for what they're distributing, because otherwise, they're going to have to actively manage every single pipeline that goes through them. It's just like YouTube. YouTube has, in the United States, YouTube has a lot of protections for them as sort of a distributor of content, meaning that if somebody were to go on their platform and post a copyrighted content, YouTube themselves can't be sued. They have to take it down when requested, but they can't be sued because all they're doing is just posting whatever somebody is, posting. So something like this sort of does put a bad taste in my mouth, because Cloudflare at this point is being punished for something somebody else is doing using their service that they now have to sit here and actively, check out. Now, granted, I will say, and I'll get into more details later on this one, I don't think this is really going to change anything, and Cloudflare themselves is already going to appeal this, but it still feels bad. As Cloudflare continued to distribute pirated content, even after receiving infringement notices in other cases as well, the plaintiffs had no choice but to file a lawsuit on February 1st, 2022. Yes, you heard that right. This has been going on for a long time. Subsequently, the case proceeded through hearings at one of the intellectual property divisions of the Tokyo District Court. The judgment recognized that Cloudflare's failure to timely and appropriately action despite receiving infringement notices from the plaintiffs, and its negligent continuation of pirated content distribution constituted aiding and abetting copyright infringement, and that Cloudflare bears liability and damages to the plaintiffs. Now, this is the part where I sort of have to kind of agree here, in the idea that there sort of does have to be some accountability here, because, again, they're actively funneling that out, and you would think that the company coming to them and saying, hey, stop doing illegal actions, you're helping illegal actions, and them basically ignoring that by their accounts here, that sounds liable. That I kind of agree with. The best way I can describe it is that if somebody keeps driving out and picking up people that are robbing banks, that person eventually has to be, held accountable for that, right? They're helping people in the act of theft. Eventually, the person driving the car, even though they're not robbing the bank, they eventually have to be held accountable, right? Again, this is that gray area. This is this gray area that's very difficult to really kind of pick a side on. And on the other end, I respect the fact that Cloudflare is taking, the responsibility of, protecting the privacy of their users very seriously. The judgment in that regard attached importance to the fact that Cloudflare, without conducting any identity verification procedures, had enabled massive manga piracy sites to operate under circumstances where strong anonymity was secured as a basis for recognizing the company's liability. Again, a lot of emphasis here on the idea that they're essentially giving them another avenue, a buffer to pirate and not be held liable. The number of works subject to this litigation is one work per company, and the amount of damages recognized in this judgment totals approximately 3.6 billion yen for 4 works alone. Since the plaintiffs had only claimed a portion of the damages they suffered, the operative part of the judgment orders payment of the total of approximately 500 million yen. This is sort of an oddity here, and this is where I sort of question what their motive was in the end with this whole situation. They technically could have filed for massive damages, but they instead chose to keep to like 1 per person. Again, they had 4 different companies here. So each of them pretty much probably picked their biggest property and then sued based on that. All I can think of is that if they went for a higher amount, it would have been more difficult to have actually won this agreement here, or maybe have had more pushback. Because 500 million yen isn't much. That's $3.3 million. Cloudflare is probably getting paid a lot more than that. This might actually be like pocket change to them. My only assumption here is they may be potentially just trying to slap them on the wrist and say, hey, next time, give us what we want or we'll do this again. This could be sort of them just kind of saying, hey, try us. You don't want to play games with us. Next time we send you a notice, you're going to listen to what we say. It could also be potentially creating a precedence. I'm not sure if that's something that is actually, happens a lot in Japan. It does happen a lot in the US. The idea that when a judgment is made, typically future judgments will refer to that. Like, well, this judge already made this call, so we're just going to go with that. I don't know. It just seems like a very small amount to really work with here. I want to hope that it's simply just them slapping them on the wrist and saying, please listen to us next time. Next time somebody's pirating our stuff and distributing in Japan, we want you to stop. We believe that CDN services themselves are services for stable and efficient delivery of legitimate content to users and are beneficial services for distribution of information and content via the internet. On the other hand, due to their nature, once CDN services are used by piracy sites, illegal pirated content can be distributed efficiently and on a large scale. Specifically through CDN services, it becomes possible to operate massive piracy sites with tens of millions or hundreds of millions of monthly visits, while using overseas servers specialized in concealing site operators' identities, known as bulletproof hosting, and keeping distribution costs low. Again, this is what I was sort of talking about earlier. This is sort of like a playbook. This is a piracy site playbook. Part of it is getting a CDN through Cloudflare. Therefore, it has been noted in the government committee report that many other CDN service providers implement various measures to prevent their services from being used for illegal content distribution, such as verifying customer identities and removing illegal content from their servers under their management when receiving notices from rights holders. In contrast, the same committee has pointed out that Cloudflare has not sufficiently implemented such preventative or responsive measures. And due to the feature of being able to receive services for free without sufficient identity verification, the company's services continue to be used by many piracy sites. This judgment clarified that the defendant bears liability for copyright infringements on such grounds as its failure to conduct any identity verification and its failure to take timely and appropriate action despite receiving infringement notifications from rights holders. We believe this is an important decision given the current situation where piracy sites operators often hide their identities and repeatedly conduct large-scale distribution using CDN services from overseas. Again, this right here makes it feel like this is them basically trying to set a precedent. Again, I don't know if that's really necessarily a thing in Japan, but it sounds like they're basically saying, look, we proved it in court, and now going forward, we have a precedent set. It'll be much easier for us to take action. But again, Cloudflare is planning on actually appealing this, so this could get overturned. I don't know. I don't know how often this kind of stuff gets overturned. We hope this judgment will be a step towards ensuring proper use of CDN services. We will continue our effort to provide the rights of works, creators, and related properties while aiming for further expansion of legitimate content. And again, I don't really necessarily find this to be too shocking, especially in Japan, that something like this would win. I'm not sure that would happen in U.S. courts. I think I've seen somewhere that Cloudflare made a report on one of its earnings or something like that, stating that they had to settle on something in U.S. courts around Japanese publishers. So it does seem like sometime in the past, I think it was in 2019, they did technically lose on something, or at least they settled on it rather than having to fight it. But I kind of wonder if something like this would actually work in the United States, just because of, again, Section 230, stuff like that, that protects these companies from essentially what people are using their service for. But again, this seemed to be more about the idea that the rights holders went to Cloudflare and said, take this down, stop doing this, and yes, technically asking for the identity of who was using their stuff so they can track it down. And Cloudflare just seemingly said, no, we're not going to deal with it. We're just a CDN. We're not the ones hosting it technically. Again, they're technically caching it, but we're not hosting it. It's not our problem. And they finally took them to court. This is, again, a very gray area that I'm very mixed on for a lot of reasons. Again, I'm not like a massive fan of piracy. I utilize piracy, and I do technically download a lot of shows, so it's not like I'm like some clean bill here. I've been around for a long time in the anime industry. I remember back in the day when you only could pirate. Like, this is nothing that's like new to me. I'm not like clean hands here. But at the same time, I do acknowledge a lot of frustrations these companies have. Anyways, that's the whole situation with this Cloudflare thing. Very, very interesting stuff. I'll be curious if eventually they will release more information and more documentation on this whole thing, because I would actually be very curious as to what sort of held this up. It does seem like a lot of this has to do with sort of how the Tokyo courts see this whole situation versus the U.S. courts. And the U.S. courts, again, a lot of it seems to be protected by, Section 230, that kind of stuff. Whereas in Japan, a lot of their ruling, I would assume, would be around the idea of them being aware of it and not doing anything to sort of take it down once they've been notified. Essentially, overlooking the copyright infringement and not doing their part to take the content down. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this information. If you did, hit the like button down below. If you like this content, want to support it more, become a member. Until next time, y'all take care.